When you think of ancient Greece, you probably picture white marble statues and smart philosophers. But the truth is, life back then was way weirder. Today, we sit at desks and send emails. Back then, you had to hustle in wild ways just to pay the bills. I'm talking about jobs that make our Monday mornings look like a vacation. Imagine being a professional armpit hair plucker, or an oracle who spent all day sniffing strange gas from a crack in the rocks. Some people made a living carving nasty curses into lead tablets to ruin someone's week. Then you had the paid scapegoats. These guys literally got beaten up for a living just to take the blame for the city's bad luck. I'm just a guy reading stories, so subscribe if you want to stay for more. Where are you listening from tonight? Let's start the story and look at the weirdest jobs in the ancient world. So let's get into it. If you went back to Athens about 2,500 years ago, you'd notice something weird right away. Most of the guys you'd see hanging out in the city center weren't actually working in the way we think about it today. They weren't sitting at desks, they weren't answering emails, and they definitely weren't clocking in to a 9-to-5 shift at a factory. If you were a citizen, meaning you were a local guy born with full rights, you actually thought that getting your hands dirty for a paycheck was kind of embarrassing. To an Athenian citizen, working for another person was basically like being a slave. They had this idea that a man should be his own boss. If you had to take orders from someone else just to buy bread, they thought you'd lost your freedom. So what did they do all day? Well, if you had a bit of money, your job was basically to be a professional neighbor. You'd wake up as the sun was coming over the hills, eat a quick piece of bread soaked in wine. Yeah, wine for breakfast was a thing. And then you'd head straight for the city square. They called this place the Agora. Think of the Agora like a mix between a busy shopping mall, a park, and a town hall. It was the heart of the city, and it was loud. You had guys selling everything from fresh fish to fancy sandals. But the citizens weren't there to work the stalls. They were there to talk. They'd spend hours arguing about politics, gossiping about who was getting sued, and deciding if the city should go to war with the neighbors. The crazy part is that the city actually paid them to show up. If you went to sit on a jury or attended a big meeting to vote on new laws, the government handed you a few coins. It wasn't a ton of money, but for a lot of guys, it was enough to keep the lights on. They figured that if you were a citizen, your brain and your vote were more valuable than your muscles. But the work still had to get done, right? Someone had to build those massive marble temples that we still see today. Someone had to grow the olives, harvest the grapes, and dig silver out of the ground. That's where the slaves came in. It's a harsh truth, but the whole freedom of the Athenian citizens was built on the backs of people who had no freedom at all. Slaves did everything. If you were a wealthy Athenian, you might own dozens of people. Some slaves worked in the houses as cooks or teachers for the kids. Others worked in shops as blacksmiths or potters. But the ones who had it the worst were the guys sent to the silver mines. That was a death sentence. They'd spend all day in dark, cramped tunnels, chipping away at rocks, just so the city could mint more coins. If you weren't a slave, but you weren't a rich citizen either, you probably owned a small farm outside the city walls. This was the only real job that people actually respected. They thought working the land was noble. You'd spend your day pruning trees or checking on your goats. You'd be tired, sweaty, and covered in dirt, but since you were doing it for yourself on your own land, it was considered okay. Now, if you think the Athenians were picky about work, wait until you hear about the Spartans. Sparta was a totally different beast. In Athens, you could at least be a potter or farmer if you had to. In Sparta, if you were a citizen man, it was literally against the law for you to have a job. No joke. A Spartan man had one job and one job only, being a soldier. From the time they were 7 years old, Spartan boys were sent to military camp. By the time they were adults, they were the most dangerous guys in Greece. Because they were always training for war, they didn't have time to grow food or make shoes, so they forced a huge group of people called helots to do it for them. The helots were basically state-owned slaves who lived on the land. They did all the farming, all the heavy lifting, and all the chores. This allowed the Spartan men to spend every single day exercising and practicing with their spears. If a Spartan man tried to start a business or become a merchant, he'd be kicked out of the club. They thought making money was a distraction from killing enemies. Back in Athens, the workday usually wrapped up by noon. Once the sun got high and the heat started kicking in, the business part of the day was over. The shops in the Agora would start to close up, and the crowds would thin out. The citizens would head over to the gym. But they weren't there to hit the treadmill. They'd wrestle, run, and talk more politics while they scraped sweat off their skin with little metal tools. So you have this weird setup. You've got a whole city where the important people think work is a bummer. You've got a massive population of slaves doing the actual labor that keeps the lights on. And you've got a city square full of guys with a lot of free time and a constant need for money to buy more wine and olives. When you have a bunch of people who don't want to work normal jobs, but they still want to be rich, things get creative. This gap between the hard labor of the slaves and the lazy lifestyle of the citizens is where the weirdest jobs in history started to pop up. Since everyone was hanging out in the square all day, people started finding bizarre ways to provide services that no one else wanted to do. They found ways to profit off people's fears, their vanity, and their weird superstitions. Imagine walking through that square again as the afternoon starts. You've got the smell of roasting meat from a nearby sacrifice, the sound of 100 arguments still going on, and the constant clinking of silver coins in leather pouches. You'd see guys offering to do things for money that would make your skin crawl. This was the perfect environment for a side hustle to turn into a career. People were desperate for an edge, and they were willing to pay for some truly strange things. Think about it this way. You're standing in the middle of a crowded street in Athens, and there is absolutely nobody looking out for you. Today, we have rules for everything. We have safety inspectors, human resources departments, and laws that say you can't just sell people a jar of dirt and tell them it cures the plague. But back then, none of that existed. It was the Wild West, but with more marble and a lot more goats. If you had a pulse and a weird idea, you could turn it into a paycheck. There was no such thing as a standard job. You didn't go to school to become a middle manager. You just looked at what the city was missing that day and decided you were the guy to fix it. This total lack of rules meant people were inventing jobs on the fly. If you saw a giant pile of trash blocking a narrow alley, you didn't call the city council. You grabbed a shovel and started charging people a fee to pass through. Boom! You're now a private toll booth operator. If you saw a rich guy who was too lazy to walk his own dogs or carry his own groceries, you stepped in and made yourself his personal shadow for the day. There was no paperwork. There were no background checks. You just did the work, took the coin, and hoped you didn't get stabbed in the process. It was a pure hustle. You had to be fast, you had to be loud, and you had to be willing to do the stuff that nobody else wanted to touch. And believe me, there was a lot of stuff nobody wanted to touch. Life in these cities was messy. It was loud, it was cramped, and it was honestly pretty gross. But that mess was exactly where the money was. Because there were no safety regulations, you could do the most dangerous or disgusting things imaginable as long as you could find a customer. If you wanted to climb a giant wall to scrape off some rare moss that a doctor needed, go for it. If you fell and broke your neck, that was just your bad luck. Nobody was going to pay your family a settlement. That total lack of a safety net pushed people to be incredibly creative with how they made a living. One of the biggest drivers for these weird jobs was the fact that religion wasn't something people just did on Sundays. For the Greeks, the gods were everywhere. They were in the trees, they were in the water, and they were definitely in your business. If things were going wrong in your life, you didn't think you were just having a bad week. You thought a god was personally mad at you. And when people are scared of invisible, angry gods, they spend a lot of money to make things right. Temples weren't just pretty buildings, they were the engines of the economy. They were like a mix between a bank, a slaughterhouse, and a community center. Because people were constantly sacrificing animals to keep the gods happy, there was a never-ending supply of work. But it wasn't just the priests making money. You had a whole army of people working in the shadows of these temples. Think about the sheer amount of waste a temple produces when you're killing hundreds of animals a week. Someone has to clean that up. Someone has to deal with the bones, the hide, and the stuff left over in the guts. Those people weren't priests. They were just regular guys who realized that holy garbage man was a job with great job security. Religion and daily life were so mixed together that you couldn't really tell where one ended and the other began. This meant that a lot of jobs involved rituals that would seem totally insane to us now. You had people whose entire career was based on watching birds fly. If the birds flew left, you told the general not to go to war. If they flew right, you told him to attack. And you got paid well for that advice. You had people who spent their days cleaning statues of the gods, dressing them in expensive clothes, and even feeding them. It sounds like a hobby, but it was a specialized trade. If you were the best at polishing Zeus's big toe, you were set for life. But the real money was in the stuff that happened when things went wrong. If you thought your house was haunted, or your neighbor put a curse on your cow, you didn't call a therapist. This was someone who would come over with some sulfur, maybe a couple of unlucky chickens, and perform a ritual to clear out the bad vibes. They weren't part of any official church. They were just freelancers who knew how to put on a good show. They used the fear and the superstition of the average person to create a niche for themselves. Just in case the gods are watching, just in case this chicken blood actually works. The result of all this was a city where the job market changed every single day. One week, everyone might be terrified of a solar eclipse, so you'd see 100 guys selling eclipse-proof hats. The next week, a new temple might open up, and suddenly everyone is a professional incense waver. It was a world where you didn't find a job, you carved one out of whatever chaos was happening around you. People weren't looking for careers, they were looking for their next meal. And if that meant spent the afternoon knee-deep in ritual leftovers or shouting at a ghost in someone's basement, they did it without thinking twice. They were desperate, they were smart, and they were willing to do anything to get that edge they needed to survive another day in the sun. And if you think those basement dwellers were the only ones getting creative with their side hustles, you haven't seen anything yet. To find the real money, you had to head out into the bright Greek sun. You had to go where the action was. I'm talking about the gymnasium. Now, when I say gym, don't think about a modern room with treadmills and people in neon spandex. Think about a big, open-air dirt lot. This was the heart of the city. Every guy who wanted to be anyone spent his time here. They were training for the Olympics or just trying to look good for the neighbors. But there was a catch. These guys didn't wear clothes, not a single stitch. Instead, they'd take these big jars of olive oil and just douse themselves. They'd rub it into their skin until they were as shiny as a new coin. Why did they do it? Well, it helped keep the dirt out of their pores, and it made it a lot harder for someone to grab them during a wrestling match. You try holding on to a guy who's slicker than a buttered pig. It's impossible. So you've got all these naked, oily guys wrestling in the sand and running laps in the dust. You can probably guess what happened next. That clean olive oil didn't stay clean for long. Within 20 minutes, these athletes were coated in a thick, gray, nasty paste. It was a mixture of oil, salty sweat, dead skin cells, and whatever dirt was blowing around the yard that day. It was gross, it was heavy, and it felt like wearing a suit of mud. This is where our next group of entrepreneurs comes in. They weren't the guys lifting weights or throwing spears. They were the guys standing on the sidelines holding a weird piece of metal. These workers were called gym scrapers. I know, it sounds like the worst job in the world, but hang with me. These guys were smart. They waited for the biggest, strongest, and most famous athletes to finish their workout. When a star wrestler stepped off the mat, dripping with that oily sludge, the scraper would walk right up to him. The scraper used a tool called a strigil. It's basically just a piece of metal that's curved, almost like a long, thin spoon with the end cut off. It had a little handle on one end and a sharp but not too sharp edge on the other. The scraper would press that metal edge against the athlete's skin and pull. In one long stroke, he'd peel that layer of gray sludge right off the guy's back. It was like using a squeegee on a dirty car window. He'd do the arms, the legs, the chest, until the athlete was clean and the scraper had a pile of gunk on his tool. Now, a normal person would take that pile of dirt and sweat and throw it in the trash. But these scrapers knew better. They didn't see trash. They saw a payday. They'd take that gunk and scrape it carefully into small glass bottles or jars. They had a name for it. They called it gloios. And believe it or not, there was a massive market for it. People would actually line up to buy these little jars of dirty gym sludge. You're probably asking yourself who on earth would buy a jar of someone else's sweat and dead skin? Well, it turns out pretty much everyone. In ancient Greece, people thought that the sweat of a great athlete held a kind of magic. They figured that if a guy was strong enough to win a gold medal or throw a massive stone, then his body must have some special energy. They thought that energy stayed in his sweat even after it left his body. So they'd take this gloios home and use it as medicine. If you had a bad case of inflammation or your joints were aching, you'd reach for the jar. You'd take a big glob of that athlete's sweat paste and rub it right onto your own skin. People used it for everything. They rubbed it on their foreheads to get rid of headaches. They rubbed it on their ears if they had an earache. They even used it to treat muscle cramps. It was the ultimate ancient rub-on cream. The scrapers made a killing. Think about the overhead. They didn't have to buy ingredients. They didn't have to cook anything. Their raw material was literally falling off the bodies of people who were already there. All the scraper needed was a cheap metal tool and some jars. The more famous the athlete, the more the scraper could charge for the sludge. If you had the sweat of a champion wrestler, you could charge a premium. People would pay top dollar to rub that specific dirt on their knees. It was a perfect business model. The athletes got a free cleaning service, so they didn't mind the scrapers hanging around. The scrapers got a product they could sell for a high price, and the customers got a medicine they truly believed in. It didn't matter that it was objectively disgusting. It didn't matter that it was just dirt and body oils. In their minds, it was a miracle cure. And for the scrapers, it was a way to turn a bucket of sweat into a bucket of silver. They were the ultimate scavengers of the gym floor, and they proved that as long as people are hurting, they'll pay for just about anything that promises a fix, even if it's literally just the scrapings from a stranger's back. It was a dirty job, sure, but in a world where everyone was looking for an edge, these guys found it in the most unlikely place imaginable. They were selling the essence of strength, one jar of sludge at a time. But as weird as that sludge business was, there was an even stranger way to make a living in ancient Greece. And for this one, you didn't need to be an athlete. You didn't even need to be particularly strong. You just needed to be really good at acting like your heart was breaking into a million pieces. If you were a woman who didn't have much money, you could become a professional mourner. Think about that for a second. You got paid to show up at a stranger's house and have the worst day of your life on purpose for money. Now, you have to understand how the rich people in cities like Athens or Sparta thought. To them, your reputation was everything. It wasn't just about how you lived, it was about how you went out. If you died and your funeral was quiet, it was a total disaster. A quiet funeral meant you weren't important. It meant nobody cared that you were gone. It meant you were a nobody. And for the wealthy elite, being a nobody was a fate worse than death itself. They wanted a spectacle. They wanted the neighbors 3 blocks over to wonder if the world was ending because of all the noise coming from their house. But there was a problem. Sometimes the guy who died was actually a jerk, or maybe he just didn't have a big family. If only 5 people showed up to the funeral, the family looked bad. They looked weak. So they solved the problem the same way people solve problems today. They threw money at it. They went out and hired a crew of professional mourners to fill the gaps. If you got hired for this gig, you weren't just there to sit in the back and dab your eyes with a tissue. That wouldn't get you a paycheck. No, you had to perform. The family expected a full-on show. When the body was laid out in the house, you had to be there, and you had to be loud. We are talking about top-tier, gut-wrenching wailing. You had to scream at the top of your lungs. You had to howl. The goal was to make it sound like the most tragic event in the history of the world was happening right there in that living room. And it wasn't just about the noise. These women had a specific checklist of things they had to do to show they were grieving properly. First, they had to dress the part. They'd wear dark, dirty clothes to look like they were too sad to even wash themselves. Then they got physical. They would literally pull their own hair out. I'm not talking about a little tug. I mean grabbing clumps of hair and ripping them from their heads to show how much pain they were in. If that wasn't enough, they took it a step further. They would use their nails to scratch their own faces. They'd dig in until they drew blood. They wanted visible red marks and scratches all over their cheeks. To the people watching, those scratches were proof of intense sorrow. It showed the world that the person who died was so incredible, so important, that these women were literally tearing themselves apart because they couldn't handle the loss. Imagine walking down a street in ancient Greece and seeing a crowd of women with blood on their faces and bald spots on their heads, all screaming at the sky. You wouldn't think, oh, they're just doing their jobs. You'd think, wow, whoever died in that house must have been a king or a hero. And that was exactly the point. The family was buying status. They were paying for the illusion of being loved and respected by the entire community. The job usually followed a 3-day schedule. On the first day, the body was laid out. You'd stand around the bed and do your thing, wailing and scratching. On the second day, there was a big procession. The family would carry the body through the streets to the cemetery outside the city walls. This was the main event. This was when the professional mourners really had to earn their keep. They'd walk behind the body, making sure everyone in town heard them. They were basically a human siren, alerting every single person on the street that a rich, important person was passing by. If you were a professional mourner, you were basically a PR agent for a dead guy. You were there to make sure he looked like a legend. And for the women doing the work, it was a way to put food on the table. It was grueling, it was painful, and it was probably pretty bad for your vocal cords, but it was a steady paycheck in a world where women didn't have many ways to make their own money. This got so out of hand that it actually started to cause problems for the government. Imagine a city where every time a rich person died, there was a massive, bloody, screaming riot in the streets. It was chaotic, it was distracting, and it was getting expensive. Families were spending so much money on these professional criers that it was starting to mess with the local economy. They were trying to outdo each other. If the neighbor hired 10 mourners, you hired 20. If the neighbor's mourners scratched their faces, yours had to practically skin themselves alive. Eventually, a famous Greek leader named Solon had to step in and say, "Enough is enough." He actually passed laws to put a cap on the crazy. He made it illegal to hire these massive groups of women. He told people they couldn't scratch their faces anymore or pull their hair out. He even tried to limit how much noise they could make. He wanted funerals to be about the dead person, not a competition to see who could hire the best actors. But even with the laws, the tradition didn't just disappear. People still wanted that prestige. They still wanted to look like they mattered. So the business of professional mourning stayed alive for a long time. It was a weird, bloody, and loud way to make a living, but it worked. It turned a private moment of sadness into a public display of power. So, while the guys we talked about earlier were busy scraping sweat off athletes in the gym, these women were in the streets, turning their own pain into a product. They were selling the idea that someone was special. And in ancient Greece, if you could make someone look important, they were always willing to pay for it, even if it meant you had to lose a little hair and skin in the process. It just goes to show you that even thousands of years ago, people were obsessed with their image, and there was always someone standing by, ready to help them fake it for the right price. But look, faking your looks was just the tip of the iceberg. If you really wanted to spend your money on something weird in ancient Greece, you didn't stop at your hair or your skin. You went for their soul. And I don't mean that in some poetic, flowery way. I mean people literally paid professionals to manufacture bad luck for their neighbors. It was a massive industry. Think about it like this. You're living in Athens and you're a tavern owner. Business is okay, but the guy across the street just opened a new spot and he's got better wine and cheaper prices. You're losing money every single day. You don't try to lower your prices or get better wine. Instead, you walk down the street to a guy sitting at a small wooden table. This guy is a professional curse writer. You don't go to a priest for this, because priests handle the big gods and the public stuff. You go to this guy because he knows the gritty, dirty side of the spirit world. You walk up, you slap some coins down, and you tell him you want to ruin the guy across the street. The writer doesn't judge you. He just reaches for a thin sheet of lead. Now, lead was the go-to material for this. It was cheap, it was heavy, and most importantly, it was cold. To the Greeks, lead felt like death. It didn't have the warmth of bronze or the shine of gold. It was dull and gray. The writer takes a sharp metal tool, basically a big needle, and he asks you for the names. he writes a specific legalistic contract for the gods of the underworld. He carves the rival tavern owner's name into that lead. He carves his wife's name. He carves the name of the guy who delivers the wine. He gets really specific. You sit there and watch him work. It's a slow process. He's scratching these letters deep into the metal. Once he's finished writing the hit list, he doesn't just hand it to you like a flyer. He takes that thin lead plate and he folds it up. Sometimes he folds it so many times it looks like a little lead sandwich. Then he takes a big iron nail. He puts the nail right through the middle of the folded lead and hammers it down. The idea was that by driving a nail through the lead, you were literally pinning that person down. You were locking their luck so they couldn't move, couldn't breathe, and definitely couldn't sell wine. So now you've got this heavy, nailed piece of lead in your hand. You've paid the writer his fee, and now you have to finish the job. The writer tells you exactly what to do. You can't just throw it in the trash. You have to get it to the people in charge of the afterlife. And since there wasn't a post office for the underworld, you had to find a shortcut. Most people went straight to the local cemetery, but you didn't just drop it on the ground. You waited until the sun went down. You'd sneak into the graveyard and look for a specific kind of grave. You weren't looking for a peaceful one. You wanted the grave of someone who died young, or someone who died a violent death. The Greeks believed those spirits were still hanging around, restless and angry because they didn't get to live a full life. You'd find a crack in the tomb or dig a small hole, and you'd drop that lead plate in there. You were basically hiring a ghost to be your personal delivery boy. You figured that ghost had nothing better to do, so it would take your lead note down to the gods of the dead and make sure the curse got signed, sealed, and delivered. This wasn't just for business rivals either. People used these for everything. If you were a chariot racer and you wanted the guy in the next lane to crash his horses, you'd pay for a curse tablet. If you were in a lawsuit and you were worried the other guy was a better speaker, you'd pay a writer to bind his tongue so he'd stutter in front of the judge. I've read some of these, and they get incredibly petty. One guy cursed a woman just because she wouldn't go on a date with him. He asked the gods to make her feel as cold as the lead until she changed her mind. But one of the most common ways these writers made money was through the wedding stopping business. Seriously, if you were in love with someone who was about to marry someone else, you didn't go give a big speech at the altar. You went to the curse guy. You'd pay him to write a tablet that listed every single part of the wedding. You'd pay to have that tablet buried in a well or a grave, hoping the whole event would turn into a disaster. The guys writing these things were making a killing. It was a high-volume business because everyone was constantly jealous or angry at someone. You didn't need a lot of equipment, just some scrap lead, a stylus, and a dark imagination. You didn't even have to be a great writer. You just had to know the right magic words that sounded official. These writers were like the dark version of a modern notary. They turned your spite into a physical object. Think about the atmosphere in those shops. You've got people lined up, not to buy bread or clothes, but to buy misery for their neighbors. It was a purely transactional way of dealing with your problems. You didn't have to be strong or brave or right. You just had to have enough money to pay the guy to scratch a name on a piece of metal. And because the Greeks were so superstitious, this worked on two levels. If the target found out they were cursed, they'd get so inside their own head that they'd probably mess up their own business or wedding out of pure stress. It was psychological warfare with a lead weight. Eventually, the ground in ancient Greece was practically paved with these things. Archaeologists have found thousands of them. They're usually all crumpled up and corroded, but when you flatten them out, the message is still there. It's a huge paper trail of people being incredibly mean to each other for a price. The crazy part is that no one really tried to stop it. It was just a service you could buy, like getting your shoes fixed. If you had a problem and you couldn't solve it with words, you solved it with a professional writer and a grave. It just goes to show that for the right amount of cash, there has always been someone willing to help you ruin someone else's day. And as long as people were jealous, these curse writers never ran out of customers.
They just sit there, day after day, hammering nails into lead and collecting coins from people who were more than happy to pay for a little bit of supernatural sabotage. It was a steady job, and in a world where everyone believed in ghosts, it was probably one of the safest bets for making a living. You didn't need a farm or a ship. You just needed a sharp needle and a very long list of enemies.
But if you really wanted to play the high-stakes game, you didn't go to a basement witch with a needle. You went to the mountains. Specifically, you went to Delphi. Now, imagine a tiny town perched on a cliff. Everyone there was basically living off one big business. It was the Temple of Apollo. This place was the center of the world back then, and it was also the home of the most profitable scam in history. If you were a king or a general and you had a big problem, you didn't check the news. You didn't call a meeting with your advisors. You grabbed a bag of gold and you hiked up a mountain to talk to a lady sitting on a stool. We call her the Pythia, or the Oracle. But here is the part they don't usually tell you in school. She wasn't some mystical queen or a daughter of the gods. Most of the time, the priests just went into town and picked out a regular woman. She was usually middle-aged, maybe a local farm wife or a widow. She didn't need a degree. She didn't even need to be able to read. She just had to be willing to sit in a dark room and breathe in some very weird fumes. Here is how the business worked. The temple was built right over a fault line in the earth. Deep underground, there were these cracks in the rock. Scientists today think these cracks let out gases like ethylene or methane. If you have ever been in a room with a gas leak, you know what happens. You get lightheaded, you feel dizzy. If you stay there long enough, you start seeing things and talking to people who aren't there. For the Greeks, this wasn't a safety hazard. It was a business model. They would take this local woman and dress her up in fancy clothes. They would lead her into a basement or an inner room where the floor had a big hole in it. Right over that hole, they put a tripod. That's just a fancy name for a tall, three-legged stool. She would climb up, sit on that stool, and wait. The gas would drift up from the ground. She would lean over the crack and just start huffing it. Pretty soon, she wasn't a local farm wife anymore. She was gone. She would start shaking, she would start sweating, and then she would start talking. She was screaming, she was babbling, she was making sounds that didn't make any sense at all. It was just loud, scary nonsense. This is where the real money came in. You see, the kings and the rich guys who traveled hundreds of miles to get here weren't allowed to just walk in and talk to her. They had to wait outside. They had to pay a massive fee just to get in line. Then they had to buy a goat or a sheep from the local farmers, take it to the temple, and let the priests kill it to see if the gods were in a good mood. If the goat didn't shake its head the right way, the priests would tell you to go home and try again tomorrow. Of course, you had to pay for the new goat, too. Once you finally got through the door, you asked your question. You would hear the woman screaming in the other room. You couldn't understand a word of it, but standing right next to her were the priests.
These guys were the real brains of the operation. They would listen to the lady's crazy shouting, and then they would walk out to the waiting king with a very serious look on their faces. They would say, "The god Apollo has spoken." That sounds like great advice, right?
So the king would get all excited. He would give the priests even more gold, head home, and start a war. But here is the trick. The priests were smart. They never gave a straight answer. If that king went to war and lost, he would come back angry. The priests would just shrug and say, "Well, the empire that fell was yours." The priests were basically the first professional consultants. They spent all day talking to travelers from all over the world. They knew which kings were broke. They knew which generals were planning a coup. They had the best intelligence network in the Mediterranean. They used all that inside info to turn the woman's drugged-up babbling into whatever advice sounded the most believable. And the money was unbelievable. We are talking about piles of gold coins, silver statues, and massive monuments. Countries would build entire treasure houses at Delphi just to hold the gifts they gave to the temple. The whole town lived off this. If you weren't a priest, you were a tour guide. If you weren't a guide, you were selling holy water or overpriced goats to tourists. The woman on the stool didn't get much out of it. She just got a headache and a lot of lung damage from the gas. But for the guys running the show, it was the perfect setup. They didn't have to work the land. They didn't have to fight in wars. All they had to do was find a lady who could handle her fumes, keep a straight face, and tell people exactly what they wanted to hear in a way that couldn't be proven wrong. Think about that the next time you pay someone for advice. In ancient Greece, the most powerful people on earth wouldn't make a single move until they paid a group of guys to translate the screams of a high lady on a stool. It was weird, it was dangerous, and it made the people in charge of it richer than anyone could imagine. It turns out, if you can convince people you have a direct line to the gods, you don't really need to have a real job. You just need a good translator and a very big crack in the floor. But look, while the priests were busy interpreting smoke and mirrors, the rich guys of Athens were busy doing something much more relatable, getting absolutely trashed. You see, being a wealthy man in ancient Greece wasn't all about philosophy and democracy. A huge part of your social life was the symposium. Now, when we hear that word today, we think of a boring academic conference with bad coffee and PowerPoint slides. But back then, a symposium was basically a frat party for grown men in bedsheets. And where there's a massive party, there is a massive mess. This brings us to one of the grossest, most back-breaking ways to make a living in the ancient world. Imagine you're one of the guys who doesn't get an invite to the party. Instead, you're the guy who shows up when the sun is just starting to peek over the hills. Your job is to deal with the aftermath. You walk into a room that smells like a dumpster behind a liquor store. The air is thick with the scent of sour wine and stale sweat. The guys who lived it up all night are gone, or they're passed out in the corner. Now it's your turn to work. First, you have to understand how these guys ate and drank. They didn't sit at tables like we do. They reclined on these long couches called klinai. They'd lean on one elbow and eat with their hands. They didn't have napkins. If their hands got greasy from a roasted piece of meat, they'd grab a piece of bread, wipe their hands on it, and then just toss the bread on the floor. They did the same thing with bones, olive pits, and gristle. By the end of the night, the floor wasn't just a floor, it was a layer of organic trash. And it wasn't just food. These guys played drinking games that were designed to be messy. The most popular one was called kotabos. Here is how you played it. You take your wine cup, which was wide and shallow, and you leave a little bit of wine at the bottom. Then you hook your finger through the handle and flick the dregs at a target across the room. The target was usually a small bronze disc balanced on a tall stand. If you hit it, the disc would fall and hit another disc, making a loud ringing sound. It sounds fun until you realize that dozens of drunk men are throwing purple liquid across a room for 5 hours straight. They missed the target a lot. They hit the walls, they hit the furniture, they hit each other. By dawn, the expensive mosaic floors were stained purple and sticky enough to peel the skin off your feet. But it gets worse. The Greeks didn't drink their wine straight. They thought only barbarians drank pure wine. They mixed it with water in a giant bowl called a crater. The problem is, they still drank a lot of it. And when you mix a massive amount of wine with a massive amount of rich, fatty food, your stomach is eventually going to give up. The Symposium was a marathon, not a sprint. Men would drink until they couldn't stand. Then they'd puke. Sometimes they'd make it to a bowl. Often they wouldn't. So, your workday starts at 5 a.m. You walk in with a bucket and a sponge. You have to get down on your hands and knees. You start by picking up the big stuff. You're grabbing handfuls of chewed up bread and gnawed on bones. You're clearing away broken pottery because, let's be honest, drunk guys break stuff. They drop their expensive painted cups or knock over the stands for the drinking games. You have to be careful not to cut your hands while you're digging through the trash on the floor. Once the trash is gone, you have to deal with the liquid. You've got pools of wine, water, and vomit. You use a big sponge to soak it up, wring it out into a bucket, and repeat. You do this over and over until the floor stops being a slip and slide. Then comes the scrubbing. Remember, these floors weren't just concrete. In the nice houses, they were beautiful mosaics made of thousands of tiny pebbles or tiles. You had to scrub the wine stains out of the cracks between the stones. If you didn't do a good job, the room would start to smell like a swamp within a few hours in the Greek heat. You also had to clean the couches. These weren't just wooden benches. They were covered in expensive fabrics and cushions. If a guest had a little too much fun and spilled his wine or lost his dinner on the upholstery, you were the one who had to get the stains out. You'd use a mixture of water and wood ash, which acted like a primitive soap to scrub the fabric. You'd have to do it quickly before the stains set. And don't forget the walls. If the kotabos players were particularly enthusiastic, the walls would be speckled with wine. You'd have to wipe down the plaster without rubbing the paint off. It was a delicate balance of being thorough and being careful. While you're doing all this, you might have to step over a guest who is still snoring on the floor. You can't exactly kick him out. He's a friend of the master of the house. You just have to clean around him while he groans in his sleep. The pay for this was bottom tier. Many of the people doing this were slaves who belonged to the household. But in larger cities, you could hire a crew to come in and handle the heavy lifting. If you were a free person doing this, you were right at the bottom of the social ladder. You were the person who dealt with the things no one else wanted to touch. You were basically a human vacuum cleaner in a world that hadn't invented the vacuum yet. But here's the kicker. The party schedule in ancient Greece was packed. There was always a festival, a wedding, or just a Tuesday night where someone wanted to show off their new wine shipment. This meant the cleanup crew was never out of work. You'd finish one house, dump your bucket of filth into the street, and head to the next villa to do it all over again. You'd spend your whole day surrounded by the smells of a party you weren't invited to. By the time the sun was high in the sky, you'd be finished. The floors would be damp but clean. The couches would be straightened. The broken pottery would be hauled away. The house would look like a temple of dignity and philosophy again. The rich guys would wake up, call for some water and maybe some honey, and look around their pristine room. They'd have no idea how much work went into erasing the evidence of their night. They didn't care about the guy with the sponge.
They just cared that the room was ready for the next round. Because in ancient Greece, the party never really stopped. It just moved to a different room, and the cleanup crew was always one step behind, waiting for the first cup to hit the floor.
So, you've got the cleanup crew sweeping up broken cups and spilled wine from the night before. But where did the partygoers actually go when they woke up with a headache and a layer of grime on their skin? They went to the baths. You have to understand, the public bathhouse wasn't just a place to get clean. It was the center of the universe. It was where you did business, caught up on the latest gossip, and, if you had the money, got yourself a total body overhaul. And I mean total. See, the Greeks were obsessed with how they looked. You've seen the statues. Not a single one of those marble guys has a hairy chest or fuzzy shoulders. In their minds, body hair was for barbarians. If you wanted to be seen as a civilized, high-class citizen, you needed to be as smooth as a baby's skin from the neck down. But back then, they didn't have nice safety razors or soothing shaving cream. They had to do it the hard way, and that's where our next weird job comes in. Imagine walking into a massive, steam-filled stone room. It's loud, it's hot, and right in the middle of it all, there are guys whose entire career is based on causing you a specific kind of physical agony. These were the professional hair pullers. Their job had a few different names, but basically they were the ancient version of an esthetician, only way more brutal. Here is how it worked. You'd pay your fee and lay down on a stone slab. The worker would start with the tweezers. These weren't the tiny, precise ones you have in your bathroom cabinet now. These were heavy metal tools designed to grab onto the coarsest, thickest hairs on a man's body. Think armpits, think backs. The worker would go in, one hair at a time, and just yank. Now think about that for a second. You aren't just getting your eyebrows shaped. You are getting every single hair under your arm pulled out by the root. It was slow, it was methodical, and it was incredibly painful. But that was just the warm-up. If you were really hairy, or if you were in a rush, the hair puller would bring out the heavy stuff, the pitch. Pitch is basically a thick, sticky resin. It's like the sap from a tree, but they'd heat it up until it was gooey and hot. They'd smear this stuff over your chest or your legs. You'd just lie there, feeling the heat sink into your skin, knowing what was coming next. Once the pitch cooled down just enough to get a grip, the worker would grab the edge and rip. It was exactly like waxing today, but without any of the modern chemicals that make it easier. It took the hair, the roots, and probably a few layers of skin along with it. The result was a perfectly smooth body, but getting there was a nightmare. And because this was all happening in a public space, everyone knew it. This is the part that really gets me. You'd think a bathhouse would be a quiet, relaxing place, a spa day, right? Not even close. It was a factory of noise. There was one guy who lived right next to a public bathhouse back then, and he wrote about how he couldn't get any work done because of the racket. He described hearing the thud of people jumping into the water, the sound of people getting massaged, and the yelling of the drink sellers. But the worst part, the screaming. He said you could always tell when someone was getting their armpits plucked because of the thin, shrill cry that would come echoing out of the building. It wasn't just one person, either. It was a constant stream of men shouting in pain as the hair pullers did their thing. The only time the screamers would shut up was when they finally got finished, or when they were trying to convince someone else to get it done. Then you had the hair pullers themselves. They didn't just work in silence. They were like carnival barkers. They'd stand there and shout at the top of their lungs, advertising their services to everyone walking by. They'd brag about how good they were at ripping hair out, making even more noise than the people they were actually hurting. They had to be loud to get customers. They were competing with a dozen other guys doing the exact same thing. Imagine being a guy walking down a street in Athens. On one side, you have a baker selling bread. On the other, you have a guy standing in the doorway of a bathhouse screaming at you to come inside so he can pour hot sap on your chest and yank your hair out. And inside the building, you hear the absolute shrieks of grown men who look like warriors but are crying like babies. It wasn't a private affair. It was a public performance of pain. Why would anyone want this job? Well, because people paid for it every single day. If you were a man who wanted to climb the social ladder, you couldn't show up to a dinner party looking like a bear. You had to pay the guy with the tweezers. These workers were essential. They were the ones who turned regular hairy guys into the perfect Greeks you see in the art museums today. They'd spend their whole day hunched over stone slabs, sweating in the steam, gripped by the smell of hot pitch and body odor. They'd listen to the same screams for 8 hours a day. Their hands were probably covered in sticky resin, and their ears were probably ringing from the noise. But they were never out of work. As long as the Greeks wanted to look like statues, the hair pullers had a steady paycheck. They didn't just stop at chests and backs either. Some clients wanted every single hair on their arms and legs gone. That meant hours of yanking and ripping. It meant the worker had to be fast and precise. If they were too slow, the client might lose their nerve and leave. If they were too messy, the skin would blister. It was a skill, in a weird way. You had to know just how hot to get the pitch and just how hard to pull. It's a strange way to make a living. You're basically a professional torturer who people actually like. You're the guy who makes people look good, even if they have to scream the whole time it's happening. And once the screaming stopped and the skin stopped being red, those guys would walk out of the baths feeling like $1,000,000. They'd head back out into the city, smooth and confident, leaving the hair puller behind to wait for the next guy who was willing to pay to get his skin ripped apart. The whole process was a cycle. The parties led to the baths led to the grooming, and the grooming led to the next social event where you could show off your smooth skin. And through it all, the loudest sound in the city wasn't always the sound of philosophy or politics. Sometimes it was just the sound of a pair of tweezers and a man who really wished he hadn't signed up for the full-body treatment. These hair pullers were the unsung heroes of Greek vanity. They did the dirty, painful work that kept the city looking like a masterpiece, one scream at a time. It was a living, and in the world of ancient business, that was all that mattered. So it turns out that making a living in the city was tough, but the Greeks didn't think the hustle ended just because your heart stopped beating. If you were an ancient Greek, you didn't just worry about paying your rent or keeping your shop open while you were alive. You had to worry about having enough cash on hand for the day you died. You see, the Greeks believed the afterlife was just another place with its own set of rules, and more importantly, its own travel fees. They didn't think you just drifted off into the sunset. They thought you had to go on a trip, and like any trip, there was a guy waiting to take your money. That guy was Charon. Now, Charon wasn't a god who sat on a throne. He was a worker. He had a very specific job, and he's been doing it for a long time. He was the ferryman. His whole life, or rather his whole existence, was built around one thing, rowing a boat back and forth across a river. This wasn't a nice river where you go fishing on a Sunday. This was the river Styx, or sometimes the Acheron, depending on who you asked. It was the border. On one side you have the world of the living. On the other side you have the world of the dead. Charon was the only guy with a boat license for that route. He was the ultimate gatekeeper. Think about the pressure of that job. You have thousands of people showing up on your doorstep every single day, all of them confused, all of them scared, and all of them wanting to get across. But Charon didn't care about your feelings. He wasn't there to give you a hug or tell you everything was going to be okay. He was there to get paid. He ran his boat like a business, and he had a very strict no pay, no play policy. If you wanted a seat on his ferry, you had to have the cash. This is where things get really weird. The Greeks were so sure about this that they built it into their funeral plans. When someone died, the family didn't just wash the body and say a prayer. They would take a small silver coin, usually an obol, and they would put it right under the person's tongue. Sometimes they put it over the eyes, but the tongue was the standard spot. It sounds gross, right? Putting a dirty coin in a dead relative's mouth? But to them, it was the most important thing they could do. If they didn't do it, they were basically sentencing their loved one to a nightmare. Imagine you're the one who just died. You wake up on the bank of this dark, foggy river. You see a tall, skinny, kind of creepy guy in a ragged cloak pulling a boat up to the shore. That's Charon. You walk up to him, hoping for a ride, but he doesn't just let you on. He sticks out his hand. He wants his tip. If you have that coin under your tongue, you spit it out, hand it over, and you get a seat. You're good to go. You get to cross over and move on to whatever comes next. But what happens if you don't have the coin? Maybe you were a poor traveler who died alone on the side of the road. Maybe your family was cheap, or they just forgot.
Or maybe you were a soldier who got left behind on a battlefield. If you show up to Charon's boat with empty pockets, you are in big trouble. Charon won't look twice at you. He won't listen to your excuses. He won't take a credit card. If you can't pay the obol, he just leaves you there. He pushes his boat off the shore and leaves you standing in the mud. And you aren't just waiting for the next boat. The rule was that if you couldn't pay, you had to wait on the shore of the river for 100 years. Just think about that for a second. 100 years of sitting on a wet, miserable riverbank with nothing to do. You aren't alive, but you aren't fully dead either. You're just stuck in the ultimate waiting room. You have to watch thousands of other people come and go, handing over their coins and getting their rides, while you just sit there in the dark. It was the worst-case scenario for a Greek. It was the ultimate embarrassment. People lived their lives making sure they would have that one tiny coin at the end. Even the poorest beggar would try to keep one obol hidden away just in case. It shows you how much the Greeks viewed the world through the lens of trade and transactions. Even the gods and the spirits were part of the economy. You didn't get into the afterlife because you were a good person. You didn't get in because you were brave or kind. You got in because you had the money to pay the ferryman. Charon himself is a fascinating character because he represents the most boring, most consistent job in history. He didn't have a boss he had to report to, and he didn't have any competition. He just rode. Left, right, left, right. He did the same thing for thousands of years. He saw kings, heroes, and villains all show up at his boat, and he treated them all exactly the same. He didn't care if you were Alexander the Great or a guy who cleaned out stables. If you had the coin, you got in. If you didn't, you stayed on the bank. There's something very grounded about that. Even in their myths, the Greeks didn't imagine the afterlife as some magical, floaty place. They imagined it as a place with logistics. There were rivers to cross, boats to maintain,
and tolls to collect. It was a job. Karen was the original gig worker, and he had the best monopoly in the world. He was the only guy in town who could get you where you needed to go, and he knew it. The physical act of rowing that boat was his entire life. Think about the sheer amount of work that involves. Day and night, with no breaks, pulling a heavy wooden boat through thick, sluggish water. The myths say the water of the Styx was heavy and dark. It wasn't easy to move through. So Karen was doing back-breaking labor. He was the blue-collar worker of the mythological world. He stayed in the shadows, did the dirty work, and made sure the system kept moving. Without him, the whole afterlife would have been backed up. The shores would have been overflowing with souls. He was the one who kept the traffic flowing. And the coin itself, the obol, tells us a lot about what the Greeks valued. It wasn't a gold bar. It wasn't a chest of jewels. It was just a small, basic piece of currency. It was the price of a loaf of bread or a cup of cheap wine. It was a humble amount. But in the context of the river, it was worth more than anything else in the world. It was the difference between peace and a century of wandering in the dark. This whole setup meant that the business of death was a huge deal for the people left behind. If you were a son or a daughter, your main job when your parents died was to make sure that coin was in place. It was a final act of service. If you failed, you weren't just being a bad kid. You were ruining their entire future. You were the reason they were stuck on that riverbank. So the Greeks took this very seriously. They didn't take chances. They made sure that coin was secure. It's a strange thought, isn't it, that the most important financial transaction of your life would happen after you were already dead. But that was the reality for them. They saw the world as a place where everything had a price, and that didn't stop at the grave. Charon was the man at the end of the line, holding out his hand, waiting for his cut. He didn't need to say anything. He didn't need to explain the rules. Everyone knew the deal. You pay the man, or you wait in the mud. And in the world of ancient Greece, no one wanted to be the guy left standing on the shore. But even if you made it across the water and paid the ferryman his coin, you weren't exactly in the clear. You see, the Greeks had this idea that just because you died, it didn't mean you got away with everything. If you did something truly terrible while you were alive, there was a special group of women waiting for you. And I'm not talking about some bored office workers. I'm talking about the Furies. These were the Underworld's version of a high-speed chase team, and they were basically the police force of the dead. But they didn't have a siren or a badge. They had wings, snakes for hair, and a serious grudge. Think of them as the ultimate bounty hunters. Their whole job, the way they earned their place in the universe, was to hunt down people who had committed the worst crimes imaginable. Specifically, they went after people who killed their own family members. In ancient Greece, that was the ultimate sin. You could get away with a lot of things, but if you laid a hand on your mom, your dad, or your brother, you were officially on the Furies' clock. And let me tell you, these ladies never took a day off. They didn't have a weekend. They didn't even have a lunch break. Once they had your scent, that was it. The chase was on. These sisters, there were 3 of them, Tisiphone, Megara, and Alecto, were built for the job. They didn't just walk after you. They flew. They screamed. It wasn't a normal scream either. It was the kind of sound that made your skin crawl and your ears bleed. Imagine trying to run through a forest at night, and you hear this high-pitched screeching sound right behind your head. Every time you think you've gotten away, you hear a wing flap or a hiss. Because, yeah, they didn't just have snakes in their hair, they used snakes as whips. Picture this. You're running down a dusty road, your heart is pounding against your ribs, and you're looking over your shoulder every 2 seconds. You haven't slept in 3 days because you know the moment you close your eyes, they'll be there. Then suddenly, you feel a stinging snap across your back. It's not leather, it's a living, breathing snake. The Furies didn't want to just catch you, they wanted to break you. They would lash out with those snake whips, leaving marks that wouldn't heal. They wanted the world to see what you were. They wanted everyone to know that you were a person who had broken the most sacred rules of the family. And they were loud. They didn't sneak up on you. They wanted you to know they were coming. They would howl and bark like dogs, circling you until you didn't know which way was up. The Greeks believed these women were the personification of a guilty conscience. You know that feeling when you do something wrong and it eats at you, like you can't eat or sleep? The Greeks just turned that feeling into 3 terrifying women with blood dripping from their eyes. And that's a literal thing. Their eyes didn't just tear up, they leaked actual blood. It was like their anger was so intense it was bursting out of their faces. They would follow their targets across the entire world. It didn't matter if you crossed the sea or climbed a mountain. If you were a king sitting on a throne, they would fly right into your palace and start screaming. They didn't care about your money or your guards. Guards can't stop a ghost monster with snake hair. They would hover over the person's bed, making sure they never got a wink of rest. They'd wait until the person was just about to fall asleep, and then they'd let out a shriek or hit them with a snake whip. It was psychological warfare as much as it was a physical beating. The result was always the same. The person they were hunting would eventually lose their mind. They'd go completely insane from the lack of sleep and the constant noise. They'd wander the streets, talking to themselves, looking over their shoulders at nothing. To everyone else, it looked like the guy was just crazy. But to the Greeks, they knew exactly what was happening. They knew the Furies were doing their job. They were the ones collecting the debt. Because in their world, justice wasn't just a concept, it was a transaction. You took a life you weren't supposed to take, and now you had to pay with your own sanity. The Furies were the ones who made sure the bill got paid. They were the cosmic debt collectors. They didn't work for the king, and half the time they didn't even listen to the gods. They worked for the natural order of things. If you messed with the roots of the family tree, they were the ones who came to chop you down. And they did it with a level of energy that would put any modern marathon runner to shame. They never got tired. They never got bored. They just kept flying, kept whipping, and kept screaming until the person they were after finally dropped dead from exhaustion or took their own life just to make the noise stop. Think about what that looked like in a crowded Greek city. You'd see a man suddenly start screaming and swatting at the air like he was being attacked by bees. He'd be covered in scratches and bite marks. People would move out of his way, not because they felt sorry for him, but because they didn't want any of that bad luck rubbing off on them. They knew the Furies were in the room. Even if they couldn't see the snakes or the wings, they could see the result. They could see the work being done. The Furies were basically the cleaning crew for the world's biggest messes. When the human legal system failed, or when a killer thought they had hidden the body well enough, the Furies were the ones who stepped in. They didn't need evidence. They didn't need a witness. They just needed the smell of blood. They'd catch the scent and start the hunt. It was a brutal way to make a living, so to speak, but the Greeks felt it was necessary. Without the Furies, they thought the whole world would just fall apart into chaos. So, if you were a criminal in ancient Greece, the police weren't your biggest worry. A jail cell was a vacation compared to what these sisters had in store. You could run, you could hide, you could try to pay off the judges, but you couldn't pay off the Furies. They didn't want your gold. They didn't want your land. They wanted your peace of mind, and they were going to take it, one snake whip at a time. They were the constant reminder that in the ancient world, your past was always right behind you, and it had a very loud, very angry voice. They didn't just kill you and get it over with. That would be too easy.
They wanted the punishment to last as long as possible. They wanted to make sure that every second of your life was filled with the memory of what you did. And they were very, very good at what they did. By the time they were done with someone, death wasn't a scary prospect anymore. It was a relief. It was the only way to finally get some God-given silence. And that's how they kept the balance. They made the price of the crime so high that nobody in their right mind would ever want to owe them a single cent. They were the ultimate deterrent, a three-woman wrecking crew that made sure the rules of the house were followed, or else. You might think having three scary debt collectors breathing down your neck is the worst way to make a living in the ancient world. But hang on. There was another job that makes getting chased for money look like a walk in the park. Imagine a city where everything is going wrong. Maybe the rain just won't fall and the dirt is turning into dust. Maybe a weird sickness is going around and people are dropping dead in the streets for no reason anyone can see. Today, we'd call that a drought or a plague. We'd look at weather patterns or germs. But the Greeks didn't think like that. Dirty like it needed a good sweep with a broom, but dirty in its soul. They figured the whole community had built up too much bad luck or pollution from people breaking rules or upsetting the gods. To fix it, they needed to find a way to take all that bad luck, put it into a container, and throw it away. Except the container wasn't a box. It was a person. This job was called the pharmakos. If that sounds a bit like the word pharmacy to you, you're exactly right. It comes from the same root. But while a modern pharmacy gives you medicine to make you feel better, in ancient Greece, the pharmakos was the medicine. They were a human sponge meant to soak up every single bit of bad energy in the city. Now, you're probably wondering who in their right mind would ever sign up for a gig where the job description ends with you getting beaten and chased out of town by an angry mob. But the Greeks were practical about this. They didn't pick the mayor or the local war hero to do this. They went looking for the people at the very bottom of the ladder. We're talking about the poorest of the poor, people who were already struggling to find their next meal. I know it sounds incredibly mean, but their logic was that if someone was already down on their luck or didn't look like a movie star, it was because the gods already didn't like them very much. That made them the perfect candidate to carry everyone else's problems. In some cities, they didn't even wait for a disaster to find their guy. They kept a couple of these people on retainer. It was like an insurance policy for the soul of the city. They'd find two people, usually a man and a woman, and keep them on the city's payroll. They lived on the public's dime. For months or even years, these pharmakoi had it pretty good. They didn't have to work in the fields. They didn't have to worry about rent or finding a place to sleep. They just sat around, ate, and waited for the world to go sideways. It was the ultimate wait-for-it job. You're basically a professional scapegoat living a life of leisure until the day the city decides it needs a reset button. When the disaster finally hit, or when the annual festival rolled around, the good times for the pharmakos got even better for a short minute. The city would throw them a massive feast. I'm talking about the absolute best food available.
They'd give them the freshest bread, the sweetest figs, and the finest cheese the city could produce. They stuffed them full of the good stuff. Why? Because you can't have a skinny, weak sponge. You want the pharmacos to be a big, healthy vessel for all that bad energy. They wanted them to be a worthy offering to the gods, even if the end goal wasn't always to kill them. They wanted the medicine to be as strong as possible. But as soon as the person was full and happy, the mood changed instantly. The party ended and the work began. The leaders of the city would lead the pharmacos through the streets, but they didn't just walk, they were paraded. People would line up on the sides of the road. Everyone showed up. The rich guys in their fancy robes, the shopkeepers, the kids and the old folks. And they weren't there to cheer or clap. They were there to unload their baggage. They'd scream at the pharmacos. They'd shout out their problems. They'd blame this one person for the fact that their cows were dying or their kids were sick. Imagine walking down the street and having thousands of people scream their worst nightmares and deepest anger right in your face. That was the first part of the process. You were absorbing the city's anger. Then things got physical. This wasn't just a verbal dressing down. The officials would take branches from certain trees. They didn't just grab any old stick off the ground either. They used specific plants, like wild fig trees or leeks. They believed these plants had a special ability to draw out the bad luck from the air and the body. They'd start hitting the pharmacos with these branches. They'd specifically aim for certain areas, like the genitals or the back. They believed this stimulated the bad luck and forced it to move out of the person's body and into the sticks, or at least forced it to settle deep into the pharmacos so it could be carried away. They hit them hard. They hit them often. By the time they reached the edge of the city, the pharmacos probably wasn't thinking about that free cheese anymore. They were just trying to stay on their feet while a whole town's worth of bad vibes was being beaten into them. Finally, the group would reach the city gates. This was the big finale. The crowd would go absolutely wild. They'd pick up stones and sticks and start throwing them. They'd chase the pharmacos out of the gates and into the wilderness. The message was simple. Don't come back. You have our plague now. You have our bad harvest. You have our sins and our mistakes. Go take them somewhere else. Some stories say the people were just left to wander off and find a new life somewhere far away. Other stories are much darker and suggest the crowd didn't stop throwing stones until the pharmacos was dead. Either way, once that person was gone, the job was over. The city felt clean again. The people would turn around, walk back through the gates, and go home feeling like they'd just had a massive spiritual shower. They'd wash their hands and act like everything was back to normal, because the trash had been taken out. You have to wonder what was going through the mind of the person who took this job. Was a year of free food and no work worth a day of being beaten and turned into a social pariah? For some of these guys, the answer was probably yes.
If you were starving on the street and had no family, a year of luxury might seem like a fair trade for a really rough afternoon and a one-way ticket to the middle of nowhere. It was a desperate way to make a living, but it was a living nonetheless. And in a world where people thought a bad crop meant the gods were personally out to get them, the pharmacos was the most important person in town, right up until the moment everyone started throwing rocks at them. It's a job that really puts your own bad Monday into perspective. You might hate your boss, but at least he's not feeding you figs just to hit you with a branch later that afternoon. The weirdest part is that the Greeks actually felt they owed these people. They were outcasts, sure, but they were also the saviors of the town in a very strange, twisted way.
They were the ones who took the hit so everyone else could keep living their lives. It was a career built on being the person nobody wanted to be, but everyone needed. And once they were gone, the town could breathe again, at least until the next time the rain stopped falling and they had to go looking for another ugly person to feed. It was a cycle of using people up and throwing them away, all in the name of keeping the gods happy and the streets clean. It just goes to show that in ancient Greece, even the most miserable person in the gutter could find a way to be useful, provided they didn't mind being the town's literal punching bag. But the pharmacos wasn't the only one finding a strange way to survive on the fringes of society. While they were busy being chased out of town, others were figuring out how to make money from the things most people would pay to avoid.
And look, some people really went out of their way to find profit in the stuff that makes most of us want to run for the hills. Take snakes, for example. Most people see a snake and they move the other way. They definitely don't want to sleep in a room full of them. But in ancient Greece, there was a whole group of people who turned that exact nightmare into a massive business. They ran these places called healing temples. Think of them as a mix between a high-end spa, a hospital, and a church. If you were sick and the local herbalist couldn't help you, you saved up your coins and you headed to a place like Epidaurus. The people working there had a very specific job. They were dream interpreters. Now that sounds like a fake job today, right? Like something someone does at a fair for $5. But back then, this was serious business. It was how they made their living. They didn't just sit in an office and wait for you to call, though. They had a whole system set up to get the money out of your pocket and into the temple treasury. So imagine you've got a bad leg or a stomach ache that won't go away. You show up at the gate. The first thing those workers do is make you pay. Nothing was free. You had to bring an animal to sacrifice or pay a fee to even get through the door. Once you're in, they don't give you medicine. They don't give you a cast. Instead, they tell you to go take a bath. They make you clean yourself up, which is probably the only normal part of this whole process. After you're clean, the workers lead you to a special building called the abaton. This was basically a giant sleeping porch, but here's the catch. You aren't sleeping on a nice mattress with a pillow. You're lying down on the hard stone floor. And you aren't alone. You're packed in there with hundreds of other sick, tired, and probably pretty smelly people. But the people you really have to worry about aren't the other patients. While you're trying to get comfortable on that cold floor, the temple workers are busy behind the scenes. These were snakes. Specifically, they used a type of long, yellowish snake that didn't have any venom. They weren't going to kill you, but you didn't know that. Imagine trying to fall asleep while you hear the sound of dozens of snakes slithering over the stone. You feel something cold and scaly slide across your ankle. Maybe one crawls right over your chest while you're staring at the ceiling. The temple workers told everyone that these snakes were sacred. They said the snakes would lick your wounds or your eyes to heal you while you slept. Now, why would the workers do this? Because they needed you to be in a very specific headspace. They wanted you tired, a little bit scared, and totally focused on the god of healing, a guy named Asclepius. They knew that if you were stressed out and sleeping in a room full of snakes, you were going to have some pretty wild dreams. And those dreams were their bread and butter. That was their product. Morning comes, and this is when the real work starts for the temple staff. You wake up, probably with a stiff neck and a few snake tracks on your legs, and the dream interpreters come around. They've got their notebooks ready.
They sit down next to you, and they ask the big question, what did you see? You might tell them you dreamed about a giant bird flying over a mountain, or maybe you dreamed about your grandmother eating a lemon. To you, it's just nonsense from a bad night's sleep. To the temple workers, it's a gold mine.
They take your weird dream and they start translating it. They don't just guess either. They had a whole system for this. If you dreamed about that bird, maybe they tell you that you need to go to a high place and breathe the mountain air. If you dreamed about the lemon, they might tell you that your stomach is too sweet and you need to eat bitter herbs for a month. They would give you a list of things to do. Maybe it was a specific diet. Maybe they told you to go run 5 miles in the dirt. Sometimes they told you to go write a poem or watch a play at the theater next door. These workers were essentially health coaches, but they used the gods and your own dreams to give themselves authority. And you listened to them because you'd already paid the entry fee and survived a night with the snakes. You weren't about to ignore the advice now. Think about the skill this took. These workers had to be part psychologist and part salesman. They had to listen to hundreds of dreams every single day and come up with advice that sounded smart enough to be true, but wasn't so hard that people would give up. They had to keep the customers happy. If people didn't get better, the word would spread and the money would stop coming in. So they also became great at marketing. When someone actually did get better, maybe their stomach ache went away after they stopped eating heavy food like the interpreter suggested, the workers didn't just let them leave. They made them pay for a permanent advertisement. They would have the patient pay a stonecutter to carve their story into a tablet. They lined the walkways with these tablets. It was like a wall of 5-star reviews. When new sick people walked in, they saw all those success stories, and they felt better about handing over their silver. But the money didn't just come from the interpretation. These were little clay models of the body part that got healed. If your ear stopped hurting, you bought a little clay ear and hung it on the wall. If your hand felt better, you bought a clay hand. The temple workers sold these models right there on site. It was a perfect business loop. You pay to get in, you pay for the interpretation, and you pay for a souvenir on your way out to say thanks. These workers were essentially running a massive medical tourism industry. They kept the snakes fed, they kept the floors clean, or clean enough, and they kept the stories moving. They made sure the atmosphere was just mysterious enough to keep people coming back. They didn't have to be doctors in the way we think of them today. They didn't need to know how the heart pumped blood or how a virus worked. They just needed to know how to tell a good story and how to make people feel like their dreams meant something. It's a strange way to make a living, right? You spend your day cleaning up after snakes and your mornings listening to strangers talk about their weirdest nightmares. But it worked.
These temples were some of the richest places in the ancient world. They had more gold and silver than some cities did. And it was all built on the idea that if you're desperate enough to get well, you'll pay a guy to tell you what your dreams mean while a snake watches from the corner of the room. It just goes to show that back then, if you could find a way to turn someone's fear or hope into a service, you could stay in business for a long, long time. They weren't just priests. They were the original wellness influencers, and they were getting rich one dream at a time.
But every good thing comes to an end, and for these weird jobs, the end was a slow-motion car crash. It started with the Romans. They didn't just show up to visit. They moved in and took over the whole house. At first, they let the Greeks keep their strange businesses. They liked the spectacle as much as anyone else. But the Romans were obsessed with 2 things: taxes and order. The money that used to stay in the local temples started heading straight to Rome instead. Then the real knockout punch arrived. A new religion called Christianity began to spread like wildfire. This wasn't just another god to add to the shelf. It was a complete shift in how everyone saw the world. To the new leaders, those wellness influencer priests and professional dream readers weren't just weird, they were dangerous. They called the old ways paganism and started shutting them down piece by piece. By the late 300s, Emperor Theodosius basically pulled the plug on the whole operation. He made a law that shut down the temples for good. He banned the ancient festivals and even killed off the Olympic Games. Just like that, 1,000 years of tradition was officially illegal. Think about how that felt for the workers. Imagine you were the person whose entire career was built on reading the future in a bowl of water or training sacred snakes. Suddenly, your office is boarded up and the doors are locked. The crowds are gone. If you keep doing your job, you might end up in a dungeon. The people doing these strange jobs had to move on and find a new way to survive. They had to get real jobs. The guy who used to sell magic potions might have ended up selling simple grain at the market. The temple guards probably joined the Roman army to pay the bills. The performers had to find new stages or just keep their mouths shut. The world got a lot more serious, and the weird, colorful side hustles of ancient Greece just faded away. The party was over, the lights were out, and a much more organized world was taking its place. It was the end of an era, and honestly, the job market has never been quite that weird since.
So that era of the weirdest Greek side hustles finally closed its doors. But if you think we've moved on to totally normal jobs, you haven't been paying attention lately. Sure, we don't hire people to cry at funerals anymore. We don't pay guys to scrape sweat off athletes with a curved metal stick. But look at what we do today. We have people who wait in line for strangers or get paid to test how dog food tastes. The point is, humans have always been willing to do the strangest things for a few coins. It didn't matter if you lived in a marble city thousands of years ago, or if you're sitting in a cubicle today. When the bills come due, the creativity kicks in. You do what you have to do to survive. Ancient Greece was just a special kind of playground for this stuff. You could spend your morning writing a curse on a piece of lead just to ruin your neighbor's luck. Then you could spend your afternoon selling your own hair or picking up discarded scraps from a public sacrifice. It was messy, it was loud, it was often pretty gross, but it worked. It kept the wheels turning, and it kept families fed. People didn't sit around worrying about their career path. They saw a need, and they filled it, no matter how weird it looked to everyone else. When you look back at all these odd jobs, which one actually sounds the best to you? Or maybe which one sounds like the least worst? Would you want to be the one selling your own tears to a grieving family? Or would you rather be the person making a living by chasing birds away from a fancy temple? There are no wrong answers here, just different levels of weirdness. I think I'd probably go with the professional mourner. At least you get to let out some steam while you work. Whatever you choose, it's clear that the human hustle hasn't changed one bit. We've just swapped the tunics for suits and the clay tablets for smartphones. The names of the jobs change every century, but the grind stays exactly the same. Thanks for hanging out and listening to these stories. I really appreciate you sticking around until the end. Catch you later.